Piranha Bytes have been making open-world action RPGs for nearly 20 years, starting with the first Gothic in 2001, and now with their most recent game, Elex, releasing in late 2017, with a sequel seemingly already in the works. All of their games, including the Risen series, which was released between Gothic and Elex, follow the same general formula with the same components. A big open world full of really tough enemies where you have to explore, complete quests, and learn new skills to work your way up the food chain so that you can survive and complete the main quest. They've basically been making the same game for almost 2 decades, with a fresh coat of paint and a handful of tweaks and twists each time, and yet their newer games have never quite reached the level of success that the original Gothic games achieved in terms of their gameplay design and execution. Elex is a surprisingly strong effort that I'd say is almost as good as Gothic 2. It has a lot more modern polish, including much more accessible controls and an actual tutorial to teach you how to play the game, but that's to be expected in this day and age, plus a much bigger world that still contains Piranha Bytes' signature detailed density and improved quest design that gives you more options and more consequences for how you choose to resolve quests. It's actually better than Gothic and Gothic 2 in a lot of ways, and yet, surprisingly, there's a lot of good stuff about the original Gothic games that have somehow never made it into subsequent Piranha Bytes games and which are sorely lacking in Elex. They had a pretty solid formula with those early games, and so it's weird, disappointing, and somewhat frustrating that, about 15 years later, some of the things that made Gothic and Gothic 2 so great still haven't found their way into Piranha Bytes' newer games. Number 1. More immersive design. One of the absolute best qualities of the original Gothic games was how immersive they truly were, not just from a lore and world-building standpoint, but also in terms of mechanical gameplay functions as well, even down to minute aesthetic details that were far ahead of their time. I've spoken at length about this subject in other videos, and I don't want to just repeat myself, but to summarize the relevant bits here, the interface felt minimalistic and unobtrusive and had some really immersive elements like the fact that the quest logs were journal entries written from your character's perspective, or how books, scrolls, and maps were physical objects in the world that you had to interact with to actually read. They also didn't have obnoxious fourth wall-breaking tutorials and pop-up messages explaining things to you, as everything you needed to know in the game was conveyed through dialogue with NPCs, explained in a diegetic contextual way, like how Scatty teaches you how to fight better by telling you to harmonize your weapon swings with your own movements. He doesn't say time your clicks with the left mouse button to attack faster. He explains things as he would to your character, not the player controlling him, and you learn things as your character would. Quest objectives and their locations were likewise explained to you through in-world descriptions like leave town through the north gate and turn right at the fork, then follow the road until you find steps leading up on your left, as opposed to giving you a waypoint marker on your map. And even in situations when the game felt like that type of thing was necessary, it did so through an actual physical map given to your character. Many of the unimmersive design elements that I criticized in my Gothic 3 and Gothic Remake playable teaser reviews actually also make their way into Elex, including things like game pausing tutorial windows, on-screen button prompts telling you how to interact with the world, outlines highlighting what you're targeting, and pop-up messages immediately informing you of the consequences of your actions. Fortunately, Elex gives you a lot of customization options to enable or disable these types of things, but unfortunately some of them feel kind of necessary while others inexplicably can't be disabled. For instance, although you can disable action hints that flash on-screen button prompts over every interactable thing you target, you can't seem to get rid of the push spacebar to climb prompts. Although Durus helps to provide an immersive explanation of how certain gameplay functions work, like NPC reactions and the coldness gauge, or that the world is incredibly dangerous and that you shouldn't go off exploring on your own right away, there's nothing in the world that teaches you how the combat system works other than the tutorial windows, and there's other valuable information in there that isn't conveyed immersively elsewhere in the game. And of course, many quests rely heavily on GPS coordinates uploaded to your map to tell you where to go. On the bright side, there is at least a contextual explanation for the interface system, as it's actually a holographic display projecting from an implant on your arm. Overall, Elex takes on a more modern, video gamey approach to its design, which kind of bugs me, but I can tolerate it in this instance because many of those options can be disabled. It helps, too, that some of those elements, like the interface and the heads-up display, have kind of a futuristic science fiction vibe to them, which is of course fitting with the game's theme. I can buy into the fact that Jax sees an outline around something he's targeting more so than the nameless hero in the Gothic remake, because Jax is a former alb heavily infused with Elex and who has a holographic PDA embedded in his arm, so it doesn't feel as out of place. Number 2. A smaller, more intimate world. This is a subjective point, but I felt like the size of the world in Gothic and Gothic 2 was nearly perfect, offering a large enough space to give you a strong sense of freedom as you explored fairly open, unrestricted maps while never overwhelming you with their size or scale. Everything felt tightly focused and incredibly dense, with no wasted space. Everywhere you looked had something interesting, and you never had to waste time traversing large, empty spaces just to get somewhere. It was a world so finely crafted with such precise and specific detail that NPCs could describe a location verbally and you could actually find it just by following their directions and looking around a little bit. If you were doing a quest and got lost or wandered off track, the world was small enough that you could use process of elimination to figure out where the objective must be, which was also aided by the fact that the maps were usually broken down into much smaller, more manageable, and well-defined areas. And since the worlds were centrally focused around a few hub areas and their surroundings, you were frequently traversing the paths between major locations and building an intimate familiarity with every rock and tree that you passed. Elex, much like Gothic 3, seems to have fallen into the trap of thinking bigger is automatically better when it comes to world design. The world in Elex is surprisingly detailed and fun to explore, with tons of interesting things everywhere you look and always something to reward your efforts in exploration, but it almost borders on being too big and unmanageable. It sometimes gets to feel overwhelming when you're just trying to focus on one specific thing and feel the game constantly pulling you in every other direction with all this interesting and potentially rewarding stuff all around you. Exploring the world in its fullest can therefore become a bit tiring and time-consuming. Quests practically necessitate the use of map markers to tell you where to go because there often isn't enough organized structure to find your next objective without them, and because the world is so much more open, literally, you can end up going way off course if you unwittingly pick the wrong direction if seeking out a quest objective without the use of the quest markers. When a quest describes the types of places and conditions under which rare plants might grow, for instance, you look at the map and go, well, that could be anywhere. Thus, the only way to realistically find that plant is to bring up the quest marker. The world is designed to be so big and spread out that you see a lot of areas once and then move on, never to see them again. You don't become as familiar with the map, including its layout or its content, especially since it's so easy to fall into autopilot following markers on your radar. It also has the effect of spreading the notable loot out so much that you spend a lot more time looting larger quantities of junk items, because there's not as much unique, interesting loot to fill out the larger space. Number 3. More desirable factions. Both Gothic and Elex use a 3-faction system, where you have a choice of 3 factions to join, which will affect your equipment options while also granting unique skills and abilities. In both cases, there's no clear good guys or bad guys, and no clear right or wrong choice, as the 3 factions are all essentially just different options, but it felt like there were more compelling, desirable reasons for choosing one faction over another in the Gothic games than in Elex, at least in terms of their backgrounds and ideologies. If you were a prisoner in the colony in Gothic 1, you might join up with the old camp for the promise of steady income that you could earn working for the ore barons, which you could spend buying goods from the outside world. Or you might join the new camp if you'd rather live a less luxurious life, hoping to find a way to one day destroy the barrier and escape the prison. Or you might join the swamp camp for their more laid-back lifestyle, farming and smoking swamp weed. In Gothic 2, your choices are the town militia and paladins, who are the only ones actively trying to protect the island from the threat of the orcs, or the mercenaries and dragon hunters who are trying to stand up for the farmers who are being oppressed by the martial rule of the paladins, or the mages of the monastery who just want to practice their magical arts and do what's in the best interest of their god, Innos. In Elex, your choices are the clerics, who use Elex to manufacture advanced technology and gain newfound mental control over the world, or the berserkers who want to convert Elex into mana so that they can terraform the destroyed planet, thus returning nature to the world, or the outlaws who follow no strict code of ethics and use Elex to make stimulating drugs while looking out for their own personal wealth and pleasure. I can see the appeal in each one of those options, however, each one of them has a major negative asterisk attached to it. The clerics worship a god of obviously suspicious origins and forcibly recruit people into their ranks against their wills with psionic mind control and brainwashing. The Berserkers have extremely draconian laws that result in exiling and even executing their own people for even talking about the benefits Elex technology might bring to their efforts. And the Outlaws are all a bunch of cutthroat assholes who don't care at all about improving the world or stopping the Alb threat as long as it doesn't interfere with their way of life. All of which can be serious reasons why you might not want to join any of those factions and why you might feel guilty having to choose one. Ultimately, my faction choice in Elex was guided by more meta aspects like whose skill tree looks the most fun and interesting and who has the coolest weapons and armor, which admittedly was partially true in the Gothic games, but it wasn't the entire basis of my decision in those games. As a result, I never really felt loyal to my faction in Elex, which I did in Gothic. Number 4. A blank slate hero. The protagonist in Gothic 1 and 2 had no defined background. Obviously, he committed some sort of crime to get himself thrown in the barrier, but what that crime actually was and what he did for a living before that was left open to your imagination so that you could roleplay as the character and put yourself in his position more easily. He didn't even have a name so that the way the characters addressed him wouldn't clash with your role as the player controlling him. NPCs could just as easily be talking to you as they were to him. Nothing in the game ever explored his background or referenced past events that you weren't witness to, so nothing ever acted to separate the character from the player. Although he sometimes acted a little snarky and sarcastic, most of the time he had a pretty neutral personality and kept his reactions to himself, thus allowing you to inject your own emotions and reactions into situations without clashing with the on-screen portrayal of the character. Elex actually gives you generally better, more robust role-playing options in terms of how you portray the protagonist, in terms of his cold meter and how he resolves quests, but the character, Jax, has a well-defined and thoroughly explored background as a former Alb commander. That makes it a little harder to identify yourself as a protagonist when characters from his past are suddenly showing up and he's acting all buddy-buddy and knowledgeable about these people when you, as a player, have zero familiarity with them. It's especially odd when the game starts introducing Jax's relatives. I had a particularly dissonant moment, for instance, when early on Jax referred to Calyx as his brother, which I assumed he meant figuratively like a brother in arms, as someone in the military might refer to their squad mates, but then found out dozens of hours later he actually meant his literal blood relative. Then when his father shows up out of nowhere, I'm going, wait, I have a father who actually exists in the game world and plays a role in the story? Why was this never established earlier? If I'm supposed to be Jax, I feel like I should know that my father was also an Alb soldier who is still actively serving with them and had big plans for me and my brother. So although the game does a good job of making you feel like you're Jax during side quests and exploration, it does the opposite during the main quest line. Number 5. New side quests and changes as chapters progressed. Most of Piranha Bytes' games follow a chapter progression system for its main quest, with each chapter revolving around completing some major step towards your ultimate goal. In Gothic, new chapters mostly meant that new enemies would spawn across the world to make it feel more alive, but Gothic 2 took this concept and expanded upon it further by adding new side quests and changing familiar areas more dramatically as the chapters progressed. Once you return to Corinus in Chapter 3, after visiting the Valley of Mines in the previous chapter, you suddenly had a new threat scattered across the map with Seeker mages trying to hunt you down, along with new quests and reactions from the various NPCs in the area to this new occurrence. In Chapter 4, after returning to the Valley of Mines, you discovered that dragon hunters have arrived, thus adding more quests with them, plus new tensions and interactions between the paladins and the dragon hunters. Then in Chapter 5, after defeating the dragons, you had orcs and lizardmen invading Corinus with more new quests to help different people deal with these new problems. Additionally, the progression of the main quest also unlocked whole new areas of the game that were previously restricted, giving you constant access to new twists and turns as you advanced the main story and went into new chapters. The world literally opened up and got bigger as you played. Elex, with its completely open world, front-loads its content, making nearly all of it available from the very start of the game. You can actually complete endgame main quest objectives several chapters before you're even tasked with them, and you can see and complete perhaps 80% or more of what the game has to offer in the very first chapter, simply by going everywhere and doing everything possible. You can even max out your faction ranking and get all of the best weapons, armor, and skills in the very first chapter, thus leaving you very little room to grow over the rest of the game. If you do everything at the start, you'll spend about half of the remaining main quests telling people, "I've already done that," and only get a handful of new quests that actually introduce new content or that weren't available in Chapter 1, and some of those are just reiterations of things you've already done previously. There aren't any new side quests in later chapters whatsoever, apart from 3 companion quests that are actually tied to chapter progression and which are secretly part of the main quest. The game world shows a lot of dynamic elements, with entire towns being slaughtered or entire factions turning against you, among many smaller things depending on your choices, but it's kind of disappointing that the game world doesn't change all that dramatically as a direct result of the main quest as you advance it through chapters. At least, not until the very end when you've actually completed it, and that there isn't a lot of extra content tucked away to be discovered in the second half of the game. Whereas Gothic and Gothic 2 progressively built up to their final chapters with constant twists and turns and extra developments, Elex starts out fairly strong and then anticlimactically runs out of steam down the stretch. Number 6. The inclusion of dungeons. Another way that the early Gothic games helped to spice up gameplay with extra content and challenges as you progressed was to sprinkle dungeons into the mix. These were self-contained levels or stages, kind of like the dungeons in a Zelda game or in an Elder Scrolls game, where you had to go into a more linearly structured environment to solve a series of puzzles and challenges to advance to the end so that you could complete some objective. Things like exploring the old mine and its labyrinthine tunnels, searching for a cog to repair the gate so that you could access the minecrawler's lair and kill the queen, or the Temple of the Sleeper where you had to activate switches in a certain order and unlock different areas to do other things so that you could reach the final boss. These were all loaded as separate maps, so there was a strong feeling like you were entering into a different place, and they were all fleshed out with major gameplay sequences that tied directly into the main story. They were pretty cool and added a lot of tension and excitement as you worked your way deeper and deeper into their sinister depths. Plus, the more linear, restricted environments provided a nice change of pace to the typical open-world freedom, giving you an even more directed gameplay experience that helps to keep things fresh and interesting so that you didn't feel like you were always doing the same thing the whole time. The closest thing we have to dungeons in Elex is the converters, huge mining lasers that the bad guys use to harvest Elex from the planet, but these are basically just a series of rooms where you kill a few enemies, loot some items, and ride an elevator up to the next floor, repeating the process a few times until you reach the top and press a button to deactivate the converter. No puzzle solving, no exploration, nothing out of the ordinary, and the whole process gets repeated 5 times with literally the exact same converter layout simply copy-pasted into a new location. Then, when you reach the Ice Palace to confront the final boss, it's just a series of empty hallways leading up to the boss chamber. Except for maybe the old Infinite Skies headquarters, where you actually have to explore a convoluted interior building layout trying to descend into a hidden basement, you spend the entire game in the vast open world wandering from place to place, never really going into anywhere with structured progression, exploration, and gameplay. That gets kind of mundane and repetitive after a while, and it's kind of weird to be playing a Piranha Bytes game where you're above ground under an open sky almost the entire time, so it would have been cool to have some of those types of dungeons in the game instead of the boring converters or in place of the empty Ice Palace. Number 7. Dynamically upgrading attack animations. In all of Piranha Bytes' games, you start out as a pathetic weakling who can barely defend himself before rising to near demigod status by the end. Besides just representing this with stats, they also demonstrated this with how your character handled his weapons. In Gothic and Gothic 2, the nameless hero started the game holding his weapons awkwardly and striking ineffectively, until you spent some skill points on sword training, at which point the animation changed to reflect your character's newfound knowledge and ability, and then changed again if you improved your proficiency even further. The combat system changed over the course of the game. Instead of simply doing more damage, you also attacked more fluidly, quickly, and aggressively, and so it felt like you, as the player, became more proficient with the combat system as your character did. Although the basic tactics and inputs for combat remained virtually the same from beginning to end, the overall feeling improved tremendously, and it was just cool to reach a new skill threshold and see your animations change to reflect that. In Elex, your combat animations remain the same from beginning to end. Investing skill points in melee combat only increases your damage and your chance to stagger enemies with each hit. All of the game's combat moves, from roll dodging to parry and counterattacks to special combo attacks, are available to you from the start of the game except for the plunging jetpack attack. So in a game with 50 or 100 hours of content, combat is going to feel pretty much the same the entire time, because once you get the hang of the combat, you're just repeating the same maneuvers for every fight, and in many cases repeating the exact same tactics. The only variety comes from switching weapon types, since different types of melee weapons, like swords, axes, and clubs, have different attack animations and special attacks, but that's not the same as feeling like you're making progress in a dynamically evolving combat system. Some of the faction abilities can have a cool, positive effect on the combat, but I really miss the upgrading attack animations from Gothic and Gothic 2, just because it was so unique. Number 8. Better balance of stats, skills, equipment, and personal skill. Gothic and Gothic 2 had pretty simple skill systems, consisting really of only 3 main stats to increase and a handful of skills to choose from, but the way it balanced with your equipment progression and personal skill was really solid. Every little point you put into something had a noticeable effect on your progression. Upgrading your weapon proficiency could unlock new attack animations, and it also increased your chances of scoring critical hits, which did huge chunks of damage. Improving your strength might give you enough to equip a better weapon, which would do more damage on its own, but even if it didn't give you enough, the extra strength still applied directly to your damage output. Investing your skill points had a tremendous impact on your character's viability in combat, but it was also possible with pure skill, understanding how the combat works, enemy tendencies, tactics, and having quick reactions, to kill most enemies at level 1 if you were good enough and patient enough. Personal skill was no substitute for better stats, but you still needed skill with the system to do well, otherwise you would get wrecked even with good stats. You needed both. Elex strips this system down significantly, linking your damage output almost exclusively to your equipment. Increasing your strength doesn't increase your damage, it just allows you to equip better weapons and learn new stat boosting skills. The melee combat skill will improve your damage by a percentage, up to 30% for really steep requirements, but the base damage goes off of your weapon damage. Weapons require different combinations of multiple stats, and the requirements don't seem to scale linearly with damage, which makes it hard to know what kind of stats you're going to need up ahead to equip better weapons and can therefore slow down your progression, unless you pick 1 or 2 upgradable weapons within the same class and stick with those for the entire game. Even then, the stat requirements for using an upgraded weapon increase dramatically, meaning you have to spend a long time saving up skill points to improve your stats enough to use an upgraded weapon, all the while your steadily increasing stats do nothing for you until you can actually equip it. Meanwhile, skill still plays an important role, obviously, but the increased weight on equipment devalues personal skill a bit, while the greatly diminished impact of attributes further reduces the depth of leveling up and getting stronger as a character. Number 9. More varied enemy types. At first glance, Elex offers a lot of variety in its enemy types, especially considering how much aesthetic difference you can discover in the game's 4 primary zones, with more traditional fantasy-looking beasts in Edan, mutants in Tavar, more sci-fi creatures in Ignadon, and snowy ice monsters in Zakor. However, therein lies the problem, as there is essentially one primary set of 8 or so enemy types in the game that have simply been reskinned and had their stats adjusted to fit the various environments. The basic raptors, which you encounter in Edan, get reskinned into Skeksis, Stoneclaws, Desert Devils, and Slime Dracons elsewhere in the world. Biters get reskinned into Scavengers, Screamers, Ice Bills, and Terror Birds. Trolls get reskinned into Mountain Trolls, Ice Trolls, and Cyclopes. The list goes on. The only real difference here, besides having different stats, is that the mutant versions often get some type of unique ranged attack that the others lack. While I must applaud the creativity involved in creating so many different looks for the same basic creature, the excitement of encountering new enemy types is diminished when, with practically every new enemy, you're realizing it's basically the same thing as something you've already encountered previously. Plus, it blurs the line in terms of where you stand relative to the rest of the world because there isn't a clear hierarchy for how strong these different variants are relative to one another. Gothic certainly had its share of cloned variants. Goblins, for instance, got reskinned into Black Goblins, Goblin Warriors, and Goblin Skeletons. Field Raiders and Mantises were just reskinned Mine Crawlers, and so on. But overall, it had a lot more variety in base enemy models. Giant rats, mole rats, scavengers, bloodflies, goblins, boars, wolves, lizards, lurkers, snappers, harpies, minecrawlers, swamp sharks, shadow beasts, skeletons, skeleton mages, zombies, orcs, golems, trolls, demons, will-o'-the-wisps were all completely different enemies that not only looked different but also attacked and behaved differently. And typically, whenever those games introduced new variants of those basic enemies, like fire lizards or minecrawler warriors, you could tell that they weren't just there for for aesthetic variety, but to add to the difficulty progression. In fact, every enemy fit into an obvious ranking in the overall hierarchy of difficulty. You could usually tell just by looking at a certain enemy how strong it might be relative to other creatures you fought. So not only did the Gothic games give you more variety in terms of enemy types, but those different enemies also served the game's progression system better by having more clearly defined tiers through which you could ascend to better understand your own strength relative to the rest of the world. Number 10. A tiered magic system. The first two Gothic games used a tiered magic system that had you learning new circles of magic as you advanced through the main story, thus unlocking access to newer, more powerful spells as you leveled up. The system allowed you to feel a sense of growth and progression as a mage, similar to how melee fighters get to equip a series of newer, better weaponry as their strength increases. For example, in Gothic 2, you started out with Fire Arrow and then later learned Fireball, a more powerful version of the basic fire projectile. In higher circles, you got Large Fireball, which let you charge the spell for even more damage, plus Small Firestorm and Large Firestorm that added a small area of effect explosion. Not only were you learning more powerful spells that do more damage, but they also looked different and added progressively new effects. And that's just for basic fire projectiles. There were a bunch of other spells to use as well, with tons of extra functionality like putting targets to sleep, freezing enemies in ice, summoning various types of allied creatures, several of which had some sort of progression towards learning better versions of those spells. The effect was that, as a mage, it felt like you were always learning something new and doing different things throughout the game. In Elex, all magic spells become available to you at the same time, as soon as you join a faction, and they all have somewhat similar attribute requirements, so there's really no restriction on what you can learn other than the order you choose to learn them in. Plus, you never unlock newer, stronger versions of existing spells. Once you learn a spell, it'll function the exact same from the beginning of the game until the end. You just improve its damage with another skill that passively improves all magic damage. To be fair, Elex also gives you magic fist weapons that act as your primary offensive magic, allowing you to cast projectile spells in 3 different modes for each weapon, and these are actually tied to your progression within your chosen faction. You're given one when you first join a faction and then get another each time you level up in that faction. However, these fist weapons are all of equal tiers. You even get your choice of which one you'll take when you first join a faction, so they're more like lateral side grades as opposed to straight upgrades. It's certainly nice to unlock more variety as you level up, but the overall selection of spells has been greatly reduced from Gothic 1 and 2, and you still never get that feeling of actually upgrading your spells and learning new magic. The whole thing is kinda stagnant. Number 11. Companions who helped you, not just you helping them. Gothic 1 and 2 didn't have companions in the way that we think of them nowadays. You didn't recruit party members to follow you around everywhere you went, carrying your inventory and helping you fight stuff and leveling up alongside you. Rather, they had friendly NPCs who were heavily involved in the main story and who sometimes accompanied you on specific quests. Characters like Diego, Milton, Gorn, and Lester felt like real friends by the end of Gothic 2 because they helped you as much as you helped them. In Gothic 1, for instance, when you're sent to retrieve the 4 focus stones for Satyrus, you bump into each of these characters who's out trying to accomplish their own thing, and you end up working together to help each other out. Later, in Gothic 2, Laris, whom you remember from the new camp in Gothic 1, helps you out by giving you money, escorting you around the island, and giving you alternate ways to join the various factions. When you had a problem in the story, you would often go to one of those guys or one of the other friendly recurring characters, and they would share some valuable insight, point you in the right direction, offer their assistance, or even tag along with you. You even get to assemble your own crew to take with you to Irdarath, and each person you bring plays some role in helping you out, even if you're the one doing most of the work. Pretty much every character in Elex, including your own companions, is there to have you do things for them. There's seemingly no benefit to gathering a group of companions, even though they're kind of implied to be necessary for the story in terms of building a following to help unite the free people of Magalan. They barely help defend Origin when it gets attacked during a scripted event, and they barely help raid the Ice Palace, but in those instances they feel more like background NPCs because they don't do anything special in those circumstances and act exactly like the other random, generic, nameless NPCs who are also present in those situations. The only thing they do is help in combat and provide experience points for completing their quests, all of which are things they ask you to do for them for no real reason. Oh, you're the person who robbed me blind while I was unconscious? Sure, I'll save your life by helping you track down a bunch of people who are trying to kill you. Let's join forces. You're doing favors for them long before establishing any kind of friendship, and in fact it takes doing their favors to even become friends with them, at which point their development as characters abruptly ends. There's only one companion who actually does something for you, and it's held off until near the very end of the game. Number 12, a genuinely intimidating enemy. The orcs served as the main enemy forces in both Gothic and Gothic 2, and they were pretty damn intimidating. There was a lot of potential for them to feel like generic inhuman bad guys who only existed in the story to give you things to fight, but there was a sense of dark, arcane, occult mystery surrounding them which made them slightly uncanny and instilled a minor sense of foreboding dread in terms of what they were up to and what their ultimate goals were. It was genuinely unnerving going into Orc territory in Gothic 1 because it was specifically cordoned off as Forbidden Lands, with no territory there ever having been charted by cartographers. And in Gothic 2, you have the ominous presence of the Palisade obscuring the Orcs' actual numbers and their intentions as the Paladins in the castle anxiously wait to see what might eventually come from behind the Palisade. Most importantly, they were really tough enemies to face in combat, and those games put you up against them very early in the story, when you were still weak and incapable of fighting them, which made them feel genuinely threatening anytime they were mentioned in or part of the story, because you knew from first-hand experience how powerful they actually were. It was actually tense and kind of scary having to venture into Orcish territory long before you were ready to fight them, and it set a pretty good barometer of how high you would have to climb to be able to stop them. The bad guys in Elex are the Albs, who consist of ordinary humans armed with high-tech weaponry and who consume raw Elex to give themselves better mental and physical prowess. You yourself are a former Alb commander who was seemingly betrayed in a coup and cast from their ranks, set on a quest for revenge. This fact alone makes them immediately less intimidating when the main character has intimate knowledge of who they are and how they function, and where you get to see a lot of that stuff in flashbacks, because there's no mystery or uncertainty surrounding them. Their history is even well known and storied to the other NPCs in the world, as they're essentially an offshoot of the Clerics faction. Worse yet, they spend most of the game off-screen, basically sitting around in the snowy mountains to the north, not really doing anything. There's an implied attack against the domed city that you never get to see, only the aftermath of it, and they eventually attack Origin, but otherwise they sit idly the whole time in their own little area minding their own business. You can go there and fight some of them if you really want, but there's no reason to until near the end of the game, and they're so far out of the way that they never interfere with anything. Otherwise, you just find a handful of roaming Alb troops in other areas of the game, but these are deliberately designed to be easier, so they never really pose a serious threat. Plus, your frequent interactions with Alb separatists, Albs who are rebelling against the ideologies of their leader, kind of blurs the line between good guy and bad guy when you've got Albs on your side of the fight, and it makes a real bad guy seem a little too mundane and ordinary. Number 13, a better penal colony. The first Gothic was set inside a magically encapsulated prison run in complete anarchy after the prisoners revolted against the guards and took over the colony. It was a lawless, ruthless place full of cutthroat scumbags who would beat you up just to steal a bit of money from you and sometimes just to prove a point. Nearly everyone was a jerk to you, and people often tried to take advantage of you, extort you, trick you, and betray you. Hardly anyone ever loaned you a helping hand, and you pretty much had to figure things out for yourself. Add in the plethora of deadly beasts and the orc warriors who roamed around outside the camps, and you were pretty much in hostile, dangerous territory everywhere you went, with the possibility of getting knocked out or even killed at any moment. Then you've got the really bleak, grim visual design of everything and the dreary, almost melancholic soundtrack putting the final touches on this utterly unique environment. Elex also features a penal colony, which is perhaps meant to be a direct reference to Gothic since they're both places where criminals and lawbreakers are sent, they're both called the Valley of Something, they both have a giant wooden mechanical lift used to access them, and they both supposedly have no way out once you're inside. Except the penal colony in Elex is actually kind of lame. People talk about it like it's some kind of hellish place, but it has pretty much the same aesthetics as the normal areas of Edan, except for a little fog in some places and spooky sound effects like cawing birds and rustling vegetation playing under the normal soundtrack. A bunch of exiled berserkers will attack you on sight, but this makes them feel like generic mob enemies as opposed to cutthroat NPCs, really no different from your average bandit or reaver. There's only one interaction with an exile who lures you into a trap in the vein of the stuff that happened frequently in Gothic. Except for one area with a bunch of mutants and another area with stalkers and poison spiders, the monsters aren't even that tough. Basically, it felt kinda disappointing because I was expecting a mini tribute to Gothic and didn't really get it. Maybe that was my false expectation, but it did feel like missed potential. Number 14. Better, more memorable music. The music in Gothic 1 and 2 played a huge role in establishing those games' unique tone and atmosphere, to the point that I would say it was almost as important as the gameplay and story. In an earlier video, I conducted an experiment where I replaced in-game music with generic, stock fantasy music and discovered that it basically stopped feeling like Gothic, which just goes to show how much of an impact the music really had. There's a lot of great design elements involved in the original game as a soundtrack, from the use of era-appropriate instrumentation tailored for each specific area to give the games a more immersive sound, along with the way Kai Rosenkranz is able to perfectly reflect the specific mood and atmosphere for each area within his compositions. But I won't get into too much detail here because I've already done that in my soundtrack review, which I'd recommend watching if you haven't already. What's really important to me is that I think most Gothic fans have an emotional attachment to the music in those games. I'm sure most of us can still vividly remember the music for the Old Camp, Corinus, the Pirate Beach, and plenty more, and simply hearing the music from other areas of the game is enough to send nostalgic memories rushing our way, not just remembering pleasant times spent playing the games, but also conjuring up specific imagery associated with the music. Simply put, I don't feel anything listening to the music in Elex. It's all fine and serviceable at creating moods and atmospheres and background ambiance, and some of it's actually pretty pleasant to listen to, but despite playing the game 4 times in less than 3 years, I just can't remember any of the actual music. And even though I literally just played it, I don't feel any sort of emotional association to specific areas, or the basic gameplay elements, or the game overall when I listen to the soundtrack. Worse yet, I can't even recognize most of the tracks, except for parts of the music in and around Goliath and Kaya's theme. Everything else is an unrecognizable blur to me. Part of the issue, I think, is that the soundtrack doesn't have much in the way of melodic structure for anything to really stand out as particularly catchy or noticeable. Most tracks are simply droning, swelling long tones on bowed strings with sparse plunking on a piano, which makes for good ambiance but not memorable music when so many of the tracks have similar stylistic compositions and similar instrumentation with scarce, almost non-existent melodies and motifs. As far as I'm aware, this is Bjorn Pankratz's first time writing a full soundtrack for a video game, and so the music is actually fairly impressive considering that, but it's just nowhere near what Kai Rosenkranz was able to do with the Gothic games and the first Risen. And that's all I have for this particular video on Elex. I've got a few more Elex videos in the works, so be on the lookout for those as I finish them. Otherwise, thanks for watching folks, and I'll talk to you next time.